want to talk to y'all about violence. Specifically, I want you to start engaging with how you define violence and what that means on a systemic scale. Violence in a legal definition is just unlawful harm using physical force or intimidation. Unlawful. And I bring that up because a lot of people still have the traditional concept of what violence is in their head, which is usually tied to the legal definition. It also implies that when police choke a man in the street for 8 minutes and 48 seconds and they're found not guilty, which in some cases they were, in other cases they weren't, that wouldn't be considered violence. Now, I'm sure an average person would look at that and say, no, that looks like violence to me. So we decouple it away from the legal definition. What are we left with? How do we form this idea? For me, the way I interpret violence is harm with intent. And it isn't just harm to a physical person. It is harm to the self. Because systemically, the systems that produce, insulate, and continue to cause circumstances that cause discrimination, prejudice, or issues, to me, are violent. You see, we have a lot of men who talk about how they're violent people, but we never talk about how the patriarchy is violent to us. That systems that cause harm to us are violent. It's violent to men, it's violent to women, it's violent to non-binary people. Systems that affect people directly and harm them should also be considered under the idea of violence. You see, the way we were taught about American protesting and civil rights were done with civil disobedience and non-violence. But that's violence in the traditional sense of saying these people didn't attack them. But the responses they received were both traditionally violent and also intentionally chose to not acknowledge the systemic violence that was done to them. I mentioned in another video, but one of the things I also consider violence is something like starvation. Intentional starvation to me is a form of violence. It's intent to harm someone's person. I know what you're thinking. That's kind of broad, and that would mean a lot of things fit in violence, which is exactly the point I'm trying to make. A lot of things should fit in the definition of violence. You should consider a company that reports billions in profit while some of their employees starve to death or require food assistance programs a form of violence. The institutions that rob women of their right over their own bodily autonomy should be seen as violence to them. The long-standing structures that have incepted and began from racist and classist understandings of human condition should be seen as violent. The reason I bring this up is because people have a very binary, rigid understanding of traditional violence, but don't acknowledge that systemic violence exists. A good example of this is actually an American person by the name of John Brown. See, John Brown was the first person in the United States to be executed for treason, specifically because he was using traditional violence to murder slavers. I'm not here to discredit whether that's violence or not. What I'm pointing out is John considered the enslavement of people violence as well. Now, I consider slavery violence. I consider poverty violence. I consider starvation violence. I consider laws that explicitly say this kind of person cannot exist, like the tons of anti-trans laws that get introduced in the United States for an insignificantly small portion of people that just want to live. I consider that behavior violence as well to these people. So if there's an entire group of people who've had their food, water, borders, electricity, humanitarian resources, access to medical supplies, and even the established buildings of both education and medical facilities restricted from them, and then they choose to respond with traditional violence, when did the violence start? When they reacted? Or when the system told them they're not allowed to exist?